Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you all. My name is Simran Jeet Singh. I'm your host of Becoming Less Racist, Lighting the Way to Anti-Racism. And I'm really excited to be joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Megan Goodwin. She has a new book, I'll show it to you. It's called Abusing Religion, Literary Persecution, Sex Scandals, and American Minority Religions. I went through it the last couple of days, and honestly, I haven't encountered something like this before. It's a new topic for me, and so everything I took away from it was a new learning. So I'm really excited to share Dr. Goodwin's brain with you today. Before we get started, I want to just introduce the program for you briefly. Our vision for this program is to offer two things that the world needs badly right now. The first is to offer insight into what's going on with racism, and that's why we try and look at different aspects of how racism manifests itself in every episode. The second thing we really try to do is how to take this newfound knowledge and move it into action. We really believe that just knowing isn't enough, that to be truly anti-racist, we must actually engage our ideas within the world. And that's why we bring in expert guests who give us wisdom on how to excavate racist ideas embedded within ourselves, and also how to deal with and address issues of racism in our society. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for being on this journey with me. Let me introduce our guest for today. Dr. Megan Goodwin is a program director of Sacred Rights, Public Scholarship on Religion. That's a Henry Luce-funded project hosted by Northeastern University. And Dr. Goodwin is also a visiting lecturer there in the Philosophy and Religion department. Along with Elise Morgenstein-Furst, she co-hosts Keeping It 101, a Killjoy's Introduction to Religion podcast. And her first book, Abusing Religion, Literary Persecution, Sex Scandals in American Minority Religions, is now available through Rutgers University Press. So thank you, Dr. Goodwin, for being here with us today. How's everything going on your end?
Everything is going, and let's let that be enough. Thank you for both having me and for showing the people the creepy cover to my book.
Well, it's appropriate in a sense, and we'll talk about why in a moment, but I first want to begin, as I do with most of my guests, and just ask you about your first encounter with racism, whether it was being a target, witnessing it, or even noticing it within yourself. Do you have a memory like that you could share with us?
You know, I do. Let me preface this by saying that I was a child only allowed to watch public television for the first 7 years of my life. And more recently have realized that I might be a little bit on the spectrum, which is a surprise only to me. So when people, and by people I mean large yellow birds, tell me that we're all equal and it doesn't matter what we look like, I take that at face value. So, I've been giving this question some thought, and I realized there are experiences in retrospect that were clearly racist, like my dad not wanting to buy the black Barbie that I picked out for my cousin or stuff at school. But the first moment where I went, oh, that's racism, was very white, very Catholic, Philly suburbs. So I will just own this. It was 7th grade, right? Where I had a friend who was obsessed with Gone with the Wind, like both the movie and the book. And I, being a voracious reader, of course, read the book. And then in 7th grade, Mississippi Burning came out, the movie. And people, 7th graders, are talking about the Klan in this why would this even happen way. Nerd life forever. And I was like, well, where the Klan comes from actually is, these bad black men would attack white women, and that's why they needed the Klan. And I'm saying it out loud to my classmates and going oh, I wonder if that's not true. I wonder if they just said that to justify killing black men after slave. Have I been lied to? What? Yeah. So that's my origin story in learning that white supremacy is a thing. I got to it late, but it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and it sounds painful, especially at that adolescent age where you're really kind of getting a sense of the world and how you're understanding what you've been taught in school doesn't actually match up with necessarily. So
Also a
Yeah.
lifelong process.
Yeah, totally. And so, okay, so your book opened up part of that process for me because, as I was mentioning earlier, there's so much in here that I haven't encountered before. And one of the central points of your book, you make this really interesting argument that the way we deal with abuse in this country is mediated by racism and white supremacy. Can you explain for us what you mean by that?
Sure, lots. I mean, lots by that. But the most, I think, basic version of that is that we like to pretend that abuse is the fault of not America, not us as a collective. It's the fault of racialized minorities or religious minorities or religiously and racialized minorities. So the really short version is we as a country tell ourselves these stories about white American women being imperiled, right, by swarthy religious outsiders who use our commitment to religious freedom against us because they want to take our women, right? So I'm looking specifically at books like Not Without My Daughter, for example, where Betty Mahmoudi, who is a real lady, a real white lady from Michigan, marries an Iranian man. And they have a beautiful, storybook life until he wants to return to Iran to visit his family after the revolution. And she uses the language of reverts. He reverts back to this violent, and she uses really animalistic language. And all of the entire book just does this. He's an animal. Muslims are animals. Iranians are animals. They hate women. This is what they do to women. And by this, I mean abuse and beat and rape women. And that's why I, the exceptional, the elect white American lady, found it within myself to escape. And like, on the one hand, it's pretty easy to look at that book and go, wow, that's really racist. Unless you're me in 7th grade. It took me a while, as I said. But the challenging part is that, like, Betty Mahmoudi is a real lady. She says that her husband abused her. As a feminist and as a person on this planet, I want to take that story seriously. That's important. Abuse happened in that relationship. At the same time, this story about one woman's abusive relationship gets extrapolated into, well, this is why we're right to be afraid of Muslims, and particularly Muslim men. This is why it is okay and in fact important for us to surveil, regulate, bomb Muslim majority countries. The movie Not Without My Daughter was actually released the same week that we went into Iraq. So what we see in my book and in these stories is these small stories that like white ladies love. They love them so much. Like Not Without My Daughter still airs on Oprah's network on the regular. My mother frickin' loves this book. And I guarantee you it's the only book she's ever read, the only book that a lot of people's moms have ever read about Islam. And they look at this and go, well, okay, I know everything I need to know about Muslim men. We're right to be scared of them. We're right to control them or surveil them or meet them with violence. And so you get the one story extrapolated into really international policy in violent ways that also make less space for religious difference in the world and in this country, right? It dehumanizes others, minoritizes Muslims in the United States, despite the fact that there have been Muslims in the United States since before there was a United States.
Yeah, so talk to us a little bit about this, about why this is a problem, right? Like you've sort of walked us through that a little bit, and I want to ask you to do a little bit more of that. Why is it a problem? So let's say we take this woman's story as truth.
Mm-hmm. Which is contested. Let's also say that she has family members and her husband push back against the story hard. So.
Right. Okay. So let's say any story in which a religious minority is mm-hmm. being charged with abuse.
Yeah.
And that happens, right? Like that's a real thing that happens. So why is it a problem for us to pay attention to that? Shouldn't we be paying attention to all stories of abuse?
Yes, 100%. We should absolutely be paying attention to all stories of abuse. Here's the thing. Religion does not cause abuse. Race does not cause abuse. We see abuse literally everywhere there are people. That's not good news, obviously. My concern is when we want to look at these stories and find the cause of abuse in a religious or a racial minority, or a religio-racial minority, if we're going to think through Judith Weisenfeld and New World Economy. So the problem is we go, all right, this story proves to me that Muslim men are abusive, and the problem is Islam. The abuse comes from Islam. Islam is an inherently abusive religion, these stories tell us. Or in the case of Mormon fundamentalists in Texas, the state of Texas said, you practice polygamy because religion. Polygamy is inherently abusive. You do polygamy because religion. The problem is religion. We need to get these kids and these women out of this religious community. And so rather than address the real systemic crisis that is the abuse of women and children and say that's on all of us, that's an everybody problem, that's an American problem, what we want to do is say, you're doing religion wrong, you're doing sex wrong, and that's what's wrong. That's why you're getting abused. And so it's another way of honestly victim blaming. Like, oh, if you're going to live in a polygamous community, if you're going to be a white lady dumb enough to marry a Muslim man, then like, that's what happens, right? And so it both, again, makes less space for lived religious difference in a country that says that it's dedicated to religious freedom, right? But it also doesn't fix abuse. Showing up with tanks in the front lawn of a community that's been expecting for truly generations the government to show up and take their kids. Government shows up with a tank, takes your kids. This does not make abuse stop happening. It means minority religious communities trust the state even less. It means that there's no place to go if you do need to get out. Because if this is the only community you've ever known and the only other option you think you have is a state that's going to take your kids, where do you go? And so abuse keeps happening, and it makes it harder to get out of an abusive relationship or a community that facilitates abuse.
That's great. That's really helpful. Let me reflect back to what I hear you're saying. I think this is a new concept for a lot of us, right? So I appreciate you helping us make this connection. I want to make sure we're getting it right. So let me reflect back what I'm hearing. Abuse happens everywhere.
Yes.
Abuse is systemic.
Yep.
And the problem with the way we deal with it is that we try to deflect it outside of whiteness. So outside of what we consider normative. And I guess it almost feels like we don't want it to be, right, psychologically, we don't want abuse to be part of something that happens around us. And so we want to be distant from it. And the way we distance it in your argument is we racialize it.
Yes, absolutely.
Along the lines of religious difference and say, oh, it's not us, it's those people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's really interesting too. I know a lot of your other guests have talked about the way that whiteness is contingent, right? Like it's not a fixed state. Race is not a fixed state. But looking at these case studies together, it's interesting to see the ways that like Mormon fundamentalists who are phenotypically about as white as they come start being described in language that we use toward Muslims. A reporter on Anderson Cooper actually referred to the FLDS, a Mormon fundamentalist sect, as the American Taliban. They talked about the modest clothing that these women wear, like burqas, and it is fascinating to watch the racialization of super pale people because they're doing religion differently in a way that gets read as not properly white, not properly religious in a very Christian sort of understanding of what religion should look like, mainstream Christian, I should say, because obviously FLDS is Christian. Not white, not Christian, not American.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, it's quite literally not something I'd ever thought of before. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, exactly. No, it's if you're joining us now, the book is Abusing Religion, Literary Persecution, Sex Scandals, and American Minority Religions. And one of the really interesting things you do in the book for me is it's about abuse, right? Like that's what you're looking at, but it's also about gender, right? A lot of this stuff is gendered, and the example you gave really makes me wonder, and I'm hoping you can help us through your expertise and understanding, like if we take a step back from abuse and we just try and understand misogyny and the hypocrisy. Like it's so hard not to notice it when we're saying the examples you're giving of like, oh, we will come to your country and save the women who are being oppressed.
Yeah.
And at the very same time, we have misogyny rampant here.
Yeah.
Is that part of the same phenomenon you're talking about here, which is like, it's you, it's not us. It's
Yes.
your problem, it's not mine.
Yes, 100%. Where we are very comfortable, we are overly comfortable in identifying misogyny as an external to the United States problem. We're a mess. So the problem is, and this is one of the things that I look at, is that we are so comfortable with these stories about Islam, for example, does this to their women, so that not only do we have like a US military incursion into Muslim majority countries like Afghanistan, you also have like white feminist organizations in the United States saying, oh, you're right, we do need to go bomb them to save the women. You've got Laura Bush saying that, national security is an issue about the rights and the dignity of women. So what we need to do to ensure the rights and the dignity of women is bomb the crap out of them and make sure that they are not getting any more foreign aid, because you can't land that in a war zone. It both doesn't make us as Americans take responsibility for the internal misogyny of our country, like we saw just today, or not today, but this week with AOC, right? We don't want to address the fact that being a woman in our federal government means that she faces that kind of horrible, misogynist, violent language in her place of work. And then the New York Times wants to talk about her being disruptive, but I digress. We let ourselves off the bat for that, but then we also do this horrible hypocritical thing of like pretending we give a crap about women, and the way that we give a crap about women is outside the country and by bombing them. So again, not addressing the systemic issues and honestly making them worse.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's making me think of our failure as a society to really understand religious difference. It comes into play here, right? Like, so for example, the incursion into Afghanistan, and this long held trope of we're going there to save women who are being oppressed, and then showing up and engaging and then coming out and being like, but why are they still wearing hijabs, right? Like, why are they still wearing, like, why are they still veiling?
It's like, why won't you uncover your head, people?
Yeah, exactly. So there's this really interesting intersection of gender and religion, and how it's racialized in the context of foreign policy. And okay, I'm going to make you do a little bit more work for us, because I know you can, and not everyone can. So I'm appreciative.
Come at me.
Just give us a quick insight into how what I'm calling it a trope, right? It's a long held trope of we're going to come into your world and save the women who are being oppressed, and that hypocrisy piece really bugs me. But can you talk a little bit about how that's played out historically? Like, it's not the first time. Afghanistan wasn't the first time that happened.
It was not. Well, so yeah. Oh, so much to say there. But okay, so it is a hypocrisy. I also want to call it a willful ignorance, because if we really cared about women, we would care that Black women are dying in childbirth at horrible rates every day. We would care about the fact that if we're going to look at a Mormon fundamentalist community, that they are isolated and don't have access to education. But we are not fixing those problems. We're doing these sort of big, showy, very well-funded military incursions to save women in ways that don't help prevent abuse of women or children. So, oh lordy. Well, I will give you just one example, because there are many, right? So the first time, to the best of my knowledge, that we see US troops deployed against US citizens is against the folks in the Utah Territory at the end of the 19th century, right? We've got Mormons who have taken the US at their word, said, we are guaranteed religious freedom, and that the church or the state can't pick sides, so we can do religion in the way that seems best to us. We're going to go to Utah. We have a biblical precedent for the practice of polygamy, right? Abraham did this, Isaac did this, like, people have multiple wives. The Bible says this is okay. So we're going to go out to the Utah Territory and do religion in the way that makes the most sense to us. And the level of national, truly hysteria about the practice of polygamy justifies sending state US troops against US citizens. But if you look at like the work of Sarah Berenger Gordon in the Mormon question, she suggests that it's possible we cared less about the women than we did about like, oh, are we not going to have control of the Utah Territory? Is this a potential to like claim the assets of the nascent LDS church? So we use, as far as I can tell, women as cover to justify American imperialism. And that is absolutely a white supremacist undertaking. Because what you see in the criticisms of early Mormon polygamy are comparisons again to Islam, right? You see pictures of Joseph Smith and other early church fathers with darkened skin. You see these pictures, these orientalized pictures of a Mormon man and his many, many wives that look like they're taken out of like 19th century, like straight up Edward Said Orientalist pictures. And again, we see the ways that this idea of who can be American is really tied up in who's doing religion right, which looks like a very specific kind of Christianity, and who's doing whiteness right, which looks like a very sort of specific sort of religion and Americanness.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about my own research in South Asia and looking at the ways in which the trope of rescuing women was used to justify colonialism.
Oh yeah.
And at a time when, you know, there's all this discourse then about how women are treated poorly and don't have equal rights. And you know, everyone forgets in retrospect, like women didn't get the right to vote here until the early 20th century. And
I mean, and then
black women later,
just
right?
Women, and then we don't really see black women having access to the vote until 1965, and then we don't see Native women really having access to the vote until 1978, the year that I was born, Simran. So yeah, we really like to blame the brown folks who are not Christian for oppressing the women and not in any way take responsibility for that ourselves. Sorry.
Right.
Okay.
Right, no, totally. I appreciate that. And okay, so if you're joining us, this is Dr. Megan Goodwin. We're talking about religion, race, gender, abuse, all of those things. And this is what she writes about. This is her new book, Abusing Religion. And I want to ask you about this concept you talk about in the book that I think could be helpful for us. It's a little bit academic. So if you can help us understand what you mean by contraceptive nationalism. What does it mean, and how does it help us understand what you're describing in the book?
Okay, so contraceptive nationalism is both a very serious theoretical intervention into how we think about the way that stories shape how we can be religious, how we can be racial, how we can be American. And it's also a little bit of a joke, as I do. So contraceptive nationalism is the idea that we have these stories like Under the Banner of Heaven or Not Without My Daughter that we use to protect ourselves literally and figuratively from invasion, and I very deliberately use the term insemination, by religious outsiders, right? Think of it like a book condom. So we read these stories, sorry, but that, I mean, like that's where we're coming at it from. So we read these stories, we learn, oh no, these people are dangerous, we keep space, we regulate, we surveil, we do violence against religious outsiders as a way to both protect white American women, but also America from becoming too other. I can keep going, but did that work for you?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think one of the questions for me that comes out of it is what's with the particular emphasis on white American women? Is there not an equal attention that we pay to women of color, Black women, Indigenous women? Is that not something we see historically?
It is not something that we see historically at all. We almost don't treat Black women or Native women or Asian women or any non-white woman like they're people, like they matter, like their lives matter. And I mean, we'll do a tiny little bit of history here as well. Again, my expertise is in the United States, and my understanding of white supremacy is very focused in the United States. But our understandings of race and religion in the United States happen at the very same time. When we are getting something called the United States, we are finding ways to say, all right, well, we forcibly converted Black women and Native women to Christianity, right? After having forcibly removed them from their homes in a number of different ways. So they're Christian now. We can't justify enslaving them and killing them because they're not Christian. So there must be something else about them that makes them not okay. That's when we start getting this idea of whiteness and Blackness and Native identity. We get this idea of America being primarily for white Christian folks, or as we kind of move through history, for folks who understand religion in a very Christian way, even if they themselves are not religious. And we don't see the valuation of Black women's lives. We don't see the valuation of Native lives. And we don't see folks, actually a really good example, I think, was the recent moms demonstration in Portland, right? Where that was, I don't want to denigrate that. I think white people getting out in front of state violence is a great thing to do. I think mobilizing the fact that we are trained by all of this media, including stuff like Not Without My Daughter, to think that white women are uniquely precious, they need to be preserved, they in some way represent America. Using that to get out in front of state violence, rad. I'm hoping that they coordinated with local organizers of color and that was a thing that was asked for. Regardless though, it is powerful, and at the same time, the images of mothers mourning, mothers being angry, mothers demanding justice is nothing new. We saw this in Ferguson. We saw this at Standing Rock. Like, Standing Rock happens because a Native mother is trying to protect the land that her son is buried on. But we don't see like a broad mainstream CNN, ABC cultural valuing of those mothers' grief and anger in the same way. Yeah, there really is something about white women that is uniquely mobilizing, and I would say uniquely dangerous.
Yeah, it's really interesting to use that as an example from even just this week, where we can very specifically look at the news cycle and see, well, all this other stuff wasn't really getting attention, and all of a sudden these white moms are doing this thing, and that's a story, right? And why is that a story? That's an interesting question. Yeah, I appreciate that example. Let me ask you to do some more work for us. I want to ask you about showing us a little more around how race and religion conspire, how they come together in how we see or how we think about abuse playing out in public. And as you prepare your response, I'm gonna invite the audience to offer any questions or comments they have for Dr. Goodwin in the chat box. And we'll try and get to those as well. So walk us through an example. What does it look like to say that race and religion conspire to, I don't know, impact, affect, change, distort the way we see abuse play out in public?
Yes, this is the question for me, right? I always go to this Patricia Lockwood place. She wrote a great book called Priest Daddy about growing up in a rectory. We won't go through it. But she talks about growing up Catholic and there being this sort of ambient sense that something was happening around abuse in the clergy, and that we all kind of knew what it was, but we sort of didn't, and you wouldn't want to say anything because, and the church does so much work. So she has this refrain at the end of the book where she's watching a friend be ordained, and she just keeps thinking, got all these white men on the altar, who is protected, who is protected? And the answer is white folks, white children, white boys in particular. And this isn't to say, or to in any way dismiss the fact that there were white boys who were abused by Roman Catholic priests in the United States. That absolutely happened. That is important. I don't want to in any way dismiss that. But we also see, as the stories start breaking about Roman Catholic clergy abuse, the face of the victim becomes a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy from Boston, right? That's who we think of when we think this is the person who's been abused. When in fact, we know those boys were abused, that matters. At the same time, we know that the priests that were doing the abuse in the Northeast were moved, not first internationally, but to the Southwest. And that meant that their victims then overwhelmingly were Latino boys, Native boys, Black boys, and we did not see community responses. We did not see the kind of outrage. We did not see even the kind of monitoring within the church that had happened in the Northeast. Katie Holscher's got some really great work on this as well. I'll share that with you. So looking at the ways that we care about certain people's suffering and certain people's, we like to think of them as they should be inviolable, right? Like white womanhood should be inviolable. White children should be protected. This is who we care about. That's really one of the mobilizing things when in the Satanic Panic, which is my other case study, right? The idea that white children are at risk is really mobilizing. And it not only ignores the fact that white children are not as at risk as Black children, Latino children, Native children. It keeps us focused away from the ways that race complicates these issues. It doesn't make us take responsibility for the way that white supremacy allows, facilitates, and perpetuates abuse.
Yeah, okay. So I guess there are two things you're saying then, right? Like there's
At least.
Well, I'm trying to square your argument around race and religion and abuse. And so on the one hand, we want to keep ourselves distant. And so we first pay attention to abuse when it happens in other communities, and we racialize it and say, those are the perpetrators, those are the bad guys. And then when we actually look within white communities,
And we're forced to.
And when we're forced to, and we have to acknowledge that abuse is a problem, then what? We overly emphasize and overvalue the white experiences and neglect people of color's experience when they're victims of abuse.
Absolutely. Well, and so, yeah, the Catholic sex abuse example is where my book ends, and it's because it gets to be more complicated in like a media narrative. So if you're looking at Mormon fundamentalists, if you're looking at American Muslims, the move is you do this religion, that religion is wrong, you're doing it wrong, and I know because I know what religion is, because it looks like mainstream white Christianity. And so the reason that abuse is happening is because you did religion wrong, right? Catholicism, because it is the largest chunk of Christians in the United States, gets treated as a legitimate religion despite the fact that abuse is happening, right? You do have some folks from the outside saying, yes, Catholicism, but also hashtag not all Catholics, right? You do not have members of a Catholic congregation being all charged as sex abusers because they allowed their kids to go to that church, which is actually what we see with the FLDS community in Texas that I'm looking at. Every single adult member of that community was tagged as a sex abuser and had to come up with a plan to keep protecting the children simply because they allowed the children to live in that community, right? Tanks went in to take those kids away. We absolutely know that a staggering amount of abuse happened in so too many Catholic communities. Nobody sent tanks in about it, right? So the way that Christianities and Catholicisms that we imagine as white, even though we know that Catholicism is not only white, shout out to Tia Pratt, we still allow them a complexity that we don't allow minority religions, right? Catholics get to be the heroes of those stories even as they are the victims and as they are the perpetrators, right?
Right. No, that sounds super familiar in thinking about how race plays out and the flattening of racialized communities, right? And one of my constant frustrations as a racialized person is like when our stories are finally told and when we finally get to tell our stories, it's only a very one-dimensional story that people care about, and so that makes total sense. And let me ask you this: can you talk a little bit about how so in so much of your book you use media as the entry point into the conversation, right? Like it's books, as you talked about before, in terms of the Catholic abuse scandal, you're talking about Spotlight, the film. And so can you talk a little bit about the ways in which the sort of our engagement with media might shape our understandings of abuse.
Yeah. And our understandings of religion is the thing. I think Americans are trained to assume that religion like lives in a specific building on a certain day of the week and happens in a certain time, and that's what religion is. So they're not always aware when they're watching Sally Field and Not Without My Daughter or Anderson Cooper or the news, right? That they're getting a specific message about here's what religion should look like and here's what happens when you do it wrong, right? So if the only images you ever see of like Mormon fundamentalist women is them weeping because we've taken their children away, you get this flattening of the community into polygamy, which is absolutely what we see reflected in the legislation that happens around the community as well, right? Mormon fundamentalism equals polygamy, equals abuse, take the kids, get the women out, the end. There's no richness there in the way that we see richness for Catholicism in Spotlight.
Right, or humanity, right? Like, totally.
Well, I want to pause just because the FLDS community in El Dorado did an amazing job of pushing back and using the media in a way that we hadn't seen before. So you had those Mormon fundamentalist moms on TV saying they have taken our children. You can't just make this story about one thing. But still, we're not seeing that as much on Anderson Cooper, right? Mm-hmm. We also assume that if we're looking at like media as opposed to explicitly religious programming, that there's not a religious agenda there, or there's not a specific understanding of religion as one thing, right? We don't think of Anderson Cooper or like Abedi Mahmoudi, who's the author of Not Without My Daughter, as theorists of religion, but they are offering us a theory of what religion should look like to be respected, and a theory of what happens when you do religion wrong, i.e. abuse, right? It's sneaky. We think, oh, this is a dumb movie, it doesn't matter, or like it's the news, so there is no religious bias here. But very often Americans don't even realize that their assumptions about religion are coming from a very white, mainstreaming Christian place. So the media matters, one, because we don't always recognize it as religious, two, because it flattens these communities, it robs them of their humanity, it only gives us that one story, and three, very often it's the only religious education most Americans get. We don't talk about religion in public schools, and for like complicated historical related to Catholicism reasons, but we don't get like a religion education like they do in the UK. Not that the UK is perfect on religious difference either, obviously. People learn about religion through media. I'm not kidding when I say that Not Without My Daughter is the only book my mom has ever read about Islam. I am also not kidding when I say that I hate Under the Banner of Heaven, not only because John Krakauer is a really good writer and so makes it very convincing, but because it is both the only book that most people will ever look at about Mormon fundamentalism, but also the only book that people will ever look at about Mormons, period. And by people, I mean, yeah, my mom, absolutely, but also lawyers. Lawyers cite Under the Banner of Heaven and John Krakauer as an authority on mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints all the time. And it is so biased and so violent and so well packaged that we don't think necessarily to question those narratives unless we've been trained to.
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you the professor question now. You've given us a good. Yeah. Here we go. I'm gonna professor you. What you've given us a good sense of what's going on, and I want to ask you what's at stake. So what do we miss out on? What do we lose? What's the danger of not understanding this?
Okay. I mean, people die. Abuse keeps happening, and we make it harder and harder for people to be different from each other safely. Again, we know that folks who are the most visibly religious are also folks who are racialized and are most in danger of facing physical violence, verbal harassment. We have made it unsafe to be not white, not Christian, or not doing or not doing religion in the public square in a specific way. So if we don't understand that these stories are contributing to us being scared of people who are different from us, scared of people who are racialized or who do religion in a way that we are trained to think is wrong, even if we're not really sure why, people die and abuse keeps happening. And I always come back to this. I come back to the FLDS case a lot because one of the responses 10 years after the fact, so the raid happens in 2008, you've got Warren Jeff's bodyguard Willie Jessup's doing interviews on Oprah in a 10 years later sort of way, and he talks about the fact that because the community was raised to be scared of the outside world, with good reason, right? There's a long history of violence and surveillance of Mormons and Mormon fundamentalists. They were raised to be scared of the outside world. So anytime that there was a report that abuse was happening, they said, oh, that's the mainstream media trying to discredit us. That's not what we do. That's people from the outside telling us who we are, and we know that's not true. And Willie Jessup says, this is one of the reasons he thinks abuse happened for so long in that community. The reason that Warren Jeffs could get away with it for so long is because anytime there was a criticism, it was, that's from the Gentiles, that's from the outside, that's not us, when in fact it had been happening all along. So if we want to make abuse less common, and it is staggeringly common, we need to create conditions of possibility where folks who are being abused can get out safely, that they have resources. None of that involves sending tanks into communities. Tanks, spoilers, make no one safer. So trying to address the core causes of abuse, things like isolation, poverty, lack of education, patriarchy, the misogyny that we talked about, those things happen everywhere. They happen absolutely in the Yearning for Zion community in El Dorado, but also they happen in downtown Lubbock. And pretending that there's something unique about the abuse that happens in a small religious community as opposed to the abuse that happens 4 doors down from us or in our own homes, because that's the hardest one to address, keeps us from doing anything to prevent abuse from happening.
Can I ask you one last question? And it's a pragmatic one. At the end of your comments, you just alluded to some things we could do to improve conditions. Yeah. What would you suggest in terms of people who are listening to this program right now? Where do we start?
Cool. I'm just going to fix racism and abuse real quick. Give me a second. I mean, I think in a small, like, I'm in a white fragility place of like, I don't want to pretend that the answer to a systemic problem is individual responses, right? And I don't hear you suggesting that either. But I do think a very small, very achievable start is being conscientious about the media that we consume, the media that we give our dollars to. If folks are going to make racist stories, if folks are going to make religiously intolerant stories, let's not hype those. Let's not give them our money. Let's be very aware of who we're voting for and what sort of things they say about minority religions, about, if your rep is trying to pass an anti-Sharia law, maybe pay attention to that and don't vote for them. But also just thinking about, how can I make more space for religious and racial difference in my own community? Am I showing up at, school board meetings and saying, hey, you make space for Christmas, but what about Ramadan? It's in a very, my co-host on Keeping It 101, Elise Morgenstein First, is very upset about calendars because they pretend to be secular and they are not secular. So how can I, in my role, make just a little bit more space for religious, racial outsiders? Can I say, all right, my students are fasting during exams, so we need another option? Can I say, if we're going to represent the complexity of our campuses or the complexities of our communities, that happens out in public? Can I very specifically, this one's on me, take my role as a white lady and then go learn from the local communities about what they want and what they need? So like my action item for the day is, I just recently learned that the Somali Bantu community in Lewiston, which is about an hour north of where I live, I'm in Maine, is trying to buy land because the biggest impediment for farmers of color, and particularly Black farmers in Maine, is access to land. So like they have specifically asked, can you donate to this so that we can get land? This is a place where like I am a comfortable white lady. I can put money toward that because that's what they said they needed. And then just try to learn from the other communities that are minoritized where I am and find out what they need and then do that.
That's great. That's really helpful. And I have another pragmatic question coming in from the audience. What can we do as a society to not be those that are treating others differently just because they're not like what society says they should be? What can we do as citizens regarding how politics and religion come into play when it comes to minorities being the lower class and not treated as equal to the white superiority?
Okay, so I think there are individual and systemic responses there as well, right? So if you're thinking about, oh, do I want to support local initiatives around school funding or school lunches, or again, I'm in a very teacher space here. When we're thinking at a time when so many people are vulnerable, to assume that folks needing help isn't their fault, right? That folks who are already vulnerable in communities need help because we have set up a system that is unjust, particularly toward racial minorities, or the racially minoritized, I should say. So paying attention to those tiny things, just pay attention a little bit to systemic racism and like vote like that matters and it exists, and then everything will be fine. And then if you're thinking about just what you personally can do in your own home, aside from like, hey, these causes led by organizers of color said that they need this kind of support, so do that. But also maybe be conscientious about the media you're consuming, right? Are you only seeing one kind of story about, I'm going to keep coming back to American Muslims? Because the thing is, there are a lot of kinds of stories about American Muslims. You have to go looking harder for some than others, right? So if there are American Muslims who are telling their stories and are trying to make things more complex, go looking for those stories, talk to some folks who know about these things. As we like to say on Keeping It 101, do your homework.
That's great. And I'm gonna plug, part of my homework that, reading your book opened my eyes to is, so there are ways in which communities are flattened, and we need to complicate those understandings. And that's been sort of clear to me, I think probably because of my own personal experiences. But sometimes you don't know the ways in which race and religion intersect to create other kinds of problems, right? And so your book, if you haven't gotten it yet, Abusing Religion, like it's a good kind of homework, right? Like it'll open your eyes to something else. So let me ask you,
sure, yeah.
we have a question from David that I want to offer, and this is to you as a professor now. Have our religious studies undergrad programs failed?
Oh my goodness. Well, let's start again with a systemic response. I think religious studies undergraduate programs are more failed against than failing. I think we've seen a systemic devaluation of the humanities as less important than like skills training and STEM. And so when we find ourselves in a moment where the people who are in charge of our country want to bundle everything up as like, yeah, there's a virus, but let's also use this as an excuse to like lock up some more immigrants and keep Muslims out of the country. Humanities classes help us understand where those systems come from and how they perpetuate themselves. That universities do not value them is a problem beyond where individual religious studies professors might or might not be messing up. At the same time, a thing that I am seeing the more that I am doing this work is that particularly folks who have been in the academy for a long time have either been rewarded for not making a scene, not causing a ruckus, or have had to, if, in the case of minoritized professors, have had to keep their heads down in a lot of ways just so that they could survive in these campuses that allow white supremacy to flourish, as they all do. People are reluctant to engage new thoughts, particularly when they make us feel bad about ourselves, right? This is my work, I think, always helps us to feel a little bit worse about ourselves. But if as a white professor, since I can really only speak for myself, if I only teach things that make me feel comfortable, if I only teach and read things that reaffirm that I am right to be as I am in the world, then I never become aware of how I've both personally and systemically contributed to white supremacy. And that's not okay. So rather than saying like, all these departments messed up, A, fund the humanities. It won't fix everything, but it's a start. But also B, like I can, as a white professor, and I would encourage many other white professors to do likewise, think about where are my assumptions about who counts and who doesn't structuring my classes. So again, I will use my I statements. A thing that I am doing this semester specifically is I am teaching, I'm teaching for the 4th time my American Minority Religions class, which at Northeastern University is called Cults and Sects. I did not pick that name, it is not my fault. But I have taught this, yeah, this will be the 4th time. And usually my emphasis is on gender and sexuality. And we always talk about race because how do you talk about American religion without talking about race? You shouldn't. It does happen, but you shouldn't. This semester specifically, I am only making books required that were written by Black women. So we are specifically looking at this term cults as it gets used to control, to critique, to surveil, to do violence against minoritized religions in the United States. So we're looking at Judith Weisenfeld's New World Economy that really anchors the text. And she suggests that Black religious innovation gives folks a space to imagine both a past outside slavery and a future outside oppression. That's really exciting. We are reading So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Olu, because I have realized in the past that when I teach these classes, I kind of do like, okay, well, we're going to set up the theory on race. Good, great. Let's keep moving. And I want that to be a slower, more thoughtful, more deliberate conversation. And I think particularly for undergrad, she's a really good conversation partner for that. And then we're reading Octavia Butler's A Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, because again, written by a Black woman, is specifically about new religious movement founded by a Black woman, and does just an amazing job of both sketching out the possibilities created by religious innovation, but also being like very prophetic about the ways that climate crisis and white supremacy work together to just mess us all up. So that's what I'm doing right now. And other professors, I am happy to talk about this, and I'm on Twitter all the time. So, you know, give a shout.
If you don't follow her on Twitter, it's what, MG PhD, is that right?
That is MPG PhD. There will be curse words on it.
Yeah, and that's fine. That's how it is, right?
That's how I do.
Well, thank you so much for all your time, Dr. Goodwin. It's so kind of you to share your wisdom with us, your learnings, your insights. Like I said, a lot of what you do in the book is it's stuff I haven't really thought about. It was really eye-opening. It's abusing religion, literary persecution, sex scandals, and American minority religions. It just came out this month from Rutgers University Press. And it's just really interesting in the way it connects the dots around minoritization, gender, race, religion in America. So thanks for your time, and thanks for the book.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate being on this journey together to become less racist, and it's just wonderful to have you all as company. And I hope we move together towards anti-racism. We'll be back next week, and like today, as with every episode, we'll try to learn as much as we can about what racism has looked like in this country and what we can do about it. So take care, and thank you all.